Diana Matthews was the kind of woman who didn't just walk into a room, she brought peace with her. Raised in a quiet Christian household in Oregon, she was molded by her faith, her late grandmother's wisdom, and the sacred harmonies of gospel hymns. As the only child of a seamstress and a church organist, Diana's world was laced with scripture, Sunday potlucks, and old spirituals sung under the open sky. By 26, she had become a beloved youth choir director at her local church, where she not only nurtured young voices but also ran a free weekend soup kitchen that served the homeless and elderly. Her life was simple but purposeful: God, community, music, and service. She wasn't flashy, but she glowed in her modesty. Her laughter was known to warm even the coldest winter fellowship halls. Still, despite her outward joy, loneliness often crept in during late-night prayers. She was content but curious, wondering if love was something God had reserved for everyone else. Everything changed one spring afternoon when Diana volunteered at a Christian business conference as an usher. That was where she first saw Philip Johnson. He had the kind of smile that could break the silence of a room and wore confidence like a tailored suit. At the time, he was a new hotel trainee manager from Chicago, sent by his employer to network with Christian entrepreneurs. Philip was everything Diana wasn't used to: sharp, ambitious, and flirtatiously clever, but there was a gentleness beneath his polished exterior that intrigued her. He complimented her voice after she led the opening worship, and that brief interaction turned into an impromptu conversation over coffee after the seminar ended. He asked intelligent questions about her community work and appeared genuinely impressed. For Diana, the conversation wasn't like the one she had with church brothers who only saw her as the safe friend. Philip made her feel seen, as a woman, not just a servant of God. That night, she knelt to pray but found herself smiling through her amen. Something had shifted. The courtship began innocently. They met every other Sunday after service and spent hours walking the Riverside Park, talking about life, childhoods, and dreams. Diana was surprised to learn that Philip came from a broken home. His father, a gambler, had abandoned them when Philip was 10, and his mother raised him and his sister, Marissa, alone while juggling night shifts at a casino. Philip's resilience, he claimed, was born from watching his mother cry over unpaid bills. He had promised himself he would rise above that pain, and hospitality had become his ladder. Diana admired his strength, even when he questioned her simplistic view on contentment. She taught him to slow down and breathe. He taught her to envision bigger possibilities. Evelyn, Diana's childhood best friend, remained skeptical of him but kept her concerns quiet, for now. After 3 months of growing closer, Philip began attending church with Diana. She introduced him to the congregation as a friend, but the twinkle in her eye said otherwise. As spring blossomed around them, so did something deeper, an affection neither expected. A love ignited not by fireworks, but by quiet prayers and coffee-scented conversations. Despite Evelyn's subtle warnings and the raised eyebrows from a few church elders, Diana's relationship with Philip bloomed into something heartfelt and intentional. He started attending Sunday services more regularly, although never quite as involved as Diana. Still, his effort warmed her heart. He even volunteered once during a charity drive, lifting boxes and helping arrange food parcels. Though a bit awkward around the elderly women who fussed over him, Philip remained respectful. Diana noticed that while he struggled with vulnerability in public prayers, he always closed his eyes during worship, something that oddly comforted her. As their bond deepened, Diana's heart began to hope in new ways. Philip wasn't perfect. He had moments where ambition seemed to blind him, but he made her laugh, listened attentively, and never disrespected her boundaries. He wasn't raised in faith, but he respected hers, which to Diana was a start. Still, Evelyn continued to observe with the caution of someone who had seen too many good girls burned by charming men with hidden fire. Their first real argument happened 3 months into their relationship when Diana suggested they take part in premarital counseling. Philip laughed it off, not rudely, but with a tone that dismissed the importance of it. "Babe, we're doing fine. We don't need a shrink to tell us how to talk." Diana calmly explained it wasn't about fixing something broken, it was about preparing for a lifetime together. The conversation ended with him promising to think about it, and though he didn't commit right away, he later surprised her by scheduling a session. That night, he took her to a lake just outside the city, her favorite spot. The sky was a canvas of oranges and blues, the water a silent mirror of the heavens. As they sat under a fading sun, Philip knelt awkwardly beside her on the wooden dock, holding out a modest silver ring. "I don't have much now, but I have plans, Diana. I want to build something with you. Marry me?" The moment was raw and imperfect, but Diana's tearful yes made it perfect. She didn't care about the price of the ring, his willingness to try was enough. Their wedding was a soft-spoken affair, held in the very church where Diana had led countless worships. Her white dress had lace sleeves sewn by her mother. The floral arrangements were donated by the church women's group. Philip's best man was his childhood friend, Daryl, who flew in from Chicago, while Evelyn stood beside Diana in a lavender gown, looking beautiful but conflicted. The vows were emotional. Diana's voice trembled as she declared her devotion, while Philip's voice was steady, if slightly rehearsed. As they kissed under the church archway and the congregation clapped joyfully, Evelyn caught a glimpse of something fleeting in Philip's eyes, a flicker of calculation masked by charm. Still, the day was sacred, and Diana looked radiant, her face glowing with hope. They moved into a modest townhouse 2 streets away from the church. Philip continued climbing the hotel ladder, while Diana remained rooted in community work. For a while, it seemed like faith and ambition had finally found common ground. But beneath the harmony, subtle shifts had already begun. And the sunset that marked their beginning would soon fade into unpredictable shadows. The first 2 years of Diana and Philip's marriage passed like a carefully choreographed waltz. On the surface, they appeared to be a blissful couple, a woman of strong moral conviction and a husband with a rising career. Their townhouse brimmed with laughter during late-night Bible readings and heated debates over card games and gospel radio trivia. Diana continued her volunteer work, teaching free music lessons to neighborhood kids while expanding her church outreach programs. She also taught Sunday school, where the children adored her and often ran into her arms like she was an angel in human form. Philip, on the other hand, had started climbing the professional ladder with speed. His dedication and charm earned him a promotion from front desk supervisor to assistant manager at the boutique hotel he worked for. He started coming home later, often exhausted but filled with stories of investors, expansion plans, and hotel politics. Diana listened with pride, even when he slowly began bowing out of church functions and late-night devotionals. She rationalized his absence as the price of success. But cracks were beginning to show, small ones, like forgotten dates, distracted kisses, and a growing list of missed prayers. Things changed drastically after Diana became pregnant. Their daughter, Amira, came into their lives like a beam of light on a stormy day. The pregnancy had been delicate, months of morning sickness, a minor scare in the second trimester, and frequent hospital visits, but Diana bore it all with grace. Philip was attentive during the first few months, doting on her with smoothies and belly rubs, even building a crib by hand one weekend. But after Amira was born, his attention began to shift again. Late nights became normal. His phone rang more often, and he started silencing it around Diana. She noticed how he became unusually private with his messages and how he began locking his phone, a habit he never had before. When she raised gentle concerns, he brushed them off with a kiss or a promise to take a break soon. Diana chose patience, believing it was stress. She prayed harder and fasted for their unity. She didn't know that Philip had already started viewing her as a tether, not a partner. The woman he once pursued now reminded him of restraint, obligation, and limitations he resented but couldn't yet articulate. Amira's first birthday was the moment Diana truly sensed the change. She had planned a beautiful party in their church's fellowship hall, complete with homemade cupcakes, soft pink balloons, and gospel-themed children's music. Friends and church members came bearing gifts and love, but Philip arrived late, distracted and dressed like he had just come from a club. He whispered something about a last-minute client dinner, kissed Amira on the forehead, and barely stayed an hour before ducking out again. Evelyn noticed it immediately and confronted Diana in the kitchen, asking if everything was all right. Diana, wearing a brave smile, lied through her teeth. "He's just busy. That's all." But later that night, as she nursed Amira in the quiet nursery, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, a woman with tired eyes, a weary heart, and a sinking feeling that love was slipping through the seams. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that marriage required endurance. But something had indeed shifted. The man who once knelt on a dock and asked her to build a life together now seemed miles away, standing behind invisible walls, growing more unreachable with each passing day. Philip's promotion to head hotel manager came with an elegant new office, a company car, and a level of autonomy that fed every corner of his ambition. He basked in the applause during the formal announcement, shaking hands with board members and snapping photos for the company's press release. Diana celebrated with him the only way she knew how, by organizing a quiet dinner at home, complete with his favorite jollof rice, grilled salmon, and a small handwritten note of encouragement tucked under his plate. But Philip arrived home hours later, tipsy from a champagne toast hosted by the hotel's executive director. He barely noticed the effort Diana had put into the meal, muttering something about being exhausted before retreating to the bedroom with his phone glued to his hand. From that night onward, it seemed Philip began shedding the old version of himself, replacing it with a man who thrived on luxury, admiration, and constant validation from the outside world. The faith-based family man Diana had married was evolving into someone who viewed kindness as weakness and humility as unnecessary. It was during one of the hotel's quarterly investor brunches that Sabrina entered the picture. A high-end PR consultant contracted by the hotel, Sabrina Cole was everything Diana wasn't: flashy, flirtatious, and fluent in corporate seduction. She walked into rooms like she owned them, dripping in designer labels and carrying an expensive laugh that always drew attention. Philip was instantly smitten, though he would never admit it. She praised his management style during a presentation, touched his arm a second too long during conversations, and began tagging him in social media posts after events. Diana noticed the change, especially when Philip started dressing sharper, switching colognes, and spending long hours networking at unfamiliar lounges. He stopped answering her calls during work hours and claimed he needed mental space. When Diana asked if she could visit his office during lunch one afternoon to drop off a meal, he snapped irritably, saying it would be unprofessional. He was becoming someone else, someone she didn't recognize, and yet she refused to entertain the worst possibility. She blamed stress. She prayed harder. And when Evelyn asked questions Diana didn't have answers to, she covered her fears with rehearsed optimism. The turning point came during the hotel's anniversary gala, an exclusive black tie affair hosted in its penthouse ballroom. Evelyn had secured a last-minute invitation and convinced Diana to attend, hoping it would spark something good between the couple. Diana arrived in a modest navy blue dress, her natural curls pinned neatly, her eyes searching the crowd for her husband. But what she saw nearly collapsed her spirit. Philip stood near the bar, laughing intimately with Sabrina, his hand on the small of her back, their heads too close for comfort. The sight was a dagger through Diana's heart. When he finally noticed her, his expression faltered, not with guilt, but with irritation. He walked over and offered a stiff smile, calling her church girl in a tone that mocked rather than adored. Evelyn, ever perceptive, gripped Diana's arm and whispered, "This isn't right. You need to talk to him." But Diana, ever faithful, nodded silently and swallowed her pain. She didn't create a scene. She simply walked out, tears welling in her eyes, the sound of laughter trailing her like ghosts. That night, as Philip partied with Sabrina and business elites, Diana sat in the car with Amira's picture in her hands, whispering prayers not just for strength, but for clarity, prayers she had never thought she would need. The morning of the ACCID began like any other, quiet hymns humming from Diana's Bluetooth speaker as she packed Amira's ballet bag with care. It was Saturday, and Amira had her weekend ballet rehearsal at the community center a few miles away. Philip had already left the house hours earlier, claiming an emergency hotel briefing with board members. Diana, used to the growing pattern of his absences, didn't question it anymore. She brushed Amira's curls, tied her shoelaces, and slipped into a comfortable sundress before lifting her daughter's pink tutu bag over her shoulder and locking the door behind them. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden sheen over the sleepy suburb. As they drove through familiar streets, Diana used the quiet moment to speak affirmations to her daughter. "You are beautiful. You are strong. You are chosen." Amira repeated each one back, her tiny voice filled with joy. Diana smiled, her heart full, her soul still believing that with faith and effort, everything broken in her marriage would somehow mend. But fate had different plans that morning. As Diana approached the intersection near Park Hill Avenue, a black SUV ran a red light at full speed. The sound of tires screeching, metal crushing, and glass shattering filled the air in an instant. Diana had barely enough time to swerve slightly, shielding the side where Amira sat. The car flipped, tumbling violently before landing on its side near a concrete divider. Bystanders screamed and rushed to the scene. Amira, miraculously, was mostly unharmed, secured tightly in her booster seat and cushioned by the car's side frame. But Diana's body was limp, her head bleeding, and her lower body crushed beneath the dashboard. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the first responders worked swiftly to free her. Amira cried uncontrollably as she watched her mother being loaded into a stretcher, blood soaking her dress. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize Diana. Hours later, the orthopedic surgeon delivered the news: severe spinal trauma, fractured pelvis, and possible permanent paralysis. She would survive, but she might never walk again. Evelyn was the first to arrive at the hospital, still in her robe, clutching her chest as she was told the details. Philip, when finally reached, showed up 5 hours later, visibly irritated and reeking of cologne and alcohol. Philip's reaction at the hospital was distant, as if inconvenience had dressed itself as tragedy. He barely touched Diana's hand as she lay unconscious, tubes in her arms and bruises across her face. When Evelyn cornered him in the waiting area and demanded answers, he rolled his eyes and muttered, "She'll be fine. She's always been the strong one." It was as if the man who once knelt by the lake under a setting sun had disappeared completely, replaced by someone cold, unfamiliar, and disturbingly indifferent. The hospital admitted Diana into the trauma recovery wing, where a cocktail of medications dulled her pain but couldn't numb the betrayal she felt in her husband's absence. Sabrina didn't visit, but she sent a bouquet of exotic flowers with a pre-written card that read, "Wishing you a speedy recovery, SC." Evelyn threw it in the trash before Diana could ever see it. Days later, when Diana finally opened her eyes fully and learned the extent of her injuries, her first instinct wasn't panic, it was prayer. With Amira in her arms and Evelyn by her side, she whispered to God through a cracked voice, "If I can't walk again, help me rise another way." The accident hadn't just broken bones, it had begun shattering illusions she had protected for far too long. And deep within that hospital room, a seed of strength started to take root. The sterile scent of antiseptics, the hum of distant monitors, and the squeak of nurses' shoes became Diana's new normal in the weeks that followed her surgery. Her hospital bed was moved into a private rehabilitation room on the 3rd floor, where large windows overlooked the courtyard, though she rarely looked out. A team of doctors and physical therapists came in rotations, each bringing hopeful updates coated in caution. Her spine had narrowly missed complete severance, but the nerve damage was severe. Diana would likely never walk again without intensive therapy and the grace of healing miracles. Her lower limbs remained numb, her movements sluggish, and every breath was a reminder of the pain stitched across her body. But it wasn't the physical agony that tore her apart, it was the emotional vacuum where her husband's love should have been. Philip visited sporadically, always distracted, always on his phone. He'd offer half-hearted updates about the hotel and barely glance at Amira, who clung to her mother and grew more confused with every passing day. Diana tried to remain strong, reading her Bible aloud, quoting scripture through tears, but some nights, the weeping was louder than the word. During one of Philip's brief visits, he entered the room wearing designer loafers and an expression that seemed more annoyed than concerned. He stayed for just 15 minutes, claiming he had important guests at the hotel. Diana, seated in a new wheelchair for the first time, looked up at him, eyes tired but still hopeful. "Philip, I need you," she whispered. His response was a sigh, a glance at his watch, and a muttered, "You'll be fine, you always are." He kissed her cheek like one might pat a dog's head, then left. That was the day something inside Diana cracked, not with rage, but with realization. The man she married wasn't the man standing before her. The husband who once held her hands in prayer now couldn't even hold her gaze. Evelyn, her unrelenting pillar, began spending more time at the hospital, reading devotionals to Diana, massaging her arms, and brushing her hair when nurses were too busy. It was Evelyn who began noticing Philip's growing absence and whispered truths Diana didn't want to hear. "He's slipping away, Dee. And I think he wants you to break first." Diana, despite the mounting evidence, continued to hope. She believed in resurrection, even from love's grave. Meanwhile, little Amira was caught in a storm she couldn't understand. The once bubbly toddler who danced through the halls of their home now spent her days curled beside her mother, quiet and confused. She drew pictures with crayons, mostly of Diana standing tall in pink dresses and of a faceless man holding a balloon. When Diana asked who the man was, Amira shrugged and said, "I think it used to be Daddy." Those words stung more than any scalpel ever could. Diana tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for her daughter. She had nurses wheel her into the hospital chapel every Sunday, where she sang softly with a mirror on her lap, harmonizing hymns through tears. Philip missed every one of those Sundays. And while the world outside the hospital continued, Diana's soul was being forged in fire. She started therapy sessions with a grief counselor named Janet, a gentle woman who helped her confront her sorrow and rediscover the strength in vulnerability. Diana's prayers evolved from pleas for healing to declarations of surrender. God, if this chair is my cross, then teach me to carry it boldly. What she didn't know yet was that God was already rewriting her story behind the scenes. And the same wheelchair she viewed as a symbol of loss would soon become a chariot of unexpected destiny. The first time Philip mentioned needing more space, Diana was in the middle of a therapy session. She had just begun maneuvering her wheelchair more confidently and was hopeful about starting in-home physical therapy. He walked in mid-session, didn't greet the therapist, and instead dropped the bomb like it was a weather report. "I think it's better if I move to the guest room for a while," he muttered, looking everywhere but her face. Diana blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The therapist glanced awkwardly between them and excused herself. That night, Diana lay in her bed, the silence louder than the city noise outside their window. Philip didn't come to check on her, didn't say good night. The next few days passed with him completely absent. Evelyn tried to get answers, but Philip stopped picking her calls. The growing dread inside Diana was now screaming, something irreversible was happening. She could feel it in the distance Philip had built, and the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, and the way Amira would find his closet half empty and ask, "Where's Daddy's blue suit?" 3 nights later, Diana's world was turned upside down with cruelty wrapped in silk. It was raining, and she was watching a Christian documentary in the living room with Amira nestled beside her when the door suddenly opened. And walked Philip, with Sabrina trailing behind him, wheeling 2 silver suitcases and wearing heels that clacked against the tiled floor like gunshots. Sabrina didn't offer a hello, didn't feign civility. She simply glanced around the living room, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Is this the main house or the maid's quarters?" Philip didn't correct her. He didn't speak to Diana. He just walked past her and began issuing orders to the housekeeper, telling her to prepare the master bedroom. Amira, too young to understand but old enough to sense wrongness, began crying, clinging to her mother's lap. Diana, completely blindsided, tried to speak, but Philip raised his voice for the first time in years. "Don't start with the dramatics, Diana. I've had enough. Sabrina's staying here now. Get used to it." Evelyn arrived minutes later, after Diana had called her in tears, but the damage was done. Sabrina was in the house, wearing Philip's hoodie, claiming his bedroom like she owned it. Evelyn nearly slapped Philip but restrained herself. Instead, she told Diana, "You're not losing your mind, honey. You're just finally seeing his." 2 days later, Diana was served with divorce papers, on her hospital-grade lap tray, no less. Delivered by Philip himself while Sabrina lounged in the background, flipping through a magazine and sipping wine. The words that shattered Diana's heart came without hesitation, without remorse: "Stop bitching around and sign the damn papers." She stared at the document as if it were an obituary, of her love, her trust, her marriage. Her hands trembled as she held the pen, Evelyn standing behind her, whispering strength into her spirit. Amira peeked from the hallway, her innocent eyes watching as her world fractured silently. Diana didn't cry. Not this time. She signed the papers with the resolve of a woman who had finally seen the truth. When she handed them back, Philip scoffed and said, "Good. Now maybe we can all finally breathe." That night, Diana sat in her wheelchair by the window, rain streaking the glass like heaven weeping for her. But beneath that sadness was something else stirring, an ember of defiance, small but growing. She hadn't lost everything. She still had her daughter. She still had her faith. And somewhere deep inside, she knew, this wasn't the end of her story. Not even close. It was a bleak Monday morning when Philip stormed into the living room and announced, with no warning or shame, "You need to leave. Today." Diana, still recovering emotionally and physically, looked up from the Bible on her lap, certain she had misheard. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You heard me," he snapped. "I want you and that child out. This is my house now, and I won't let your pity parade ruin the peace I'm trying to build." "Peace?" The word felt like acid in her mouth. Behind him, Sabrina leaned against the staircase railing, sipping coffee in Philip's old bathrobe like it was just another normal day. Amira stood frozen by the hallway, clutching her favorite stuffed lamb, her lip trembling. Diana's chest tightened. The woman who had given everything to build this home was being discarded like a used napkin. No lawyer. No warning. No grace. She pleaded, "Philip, please. I have nowhere to go, at least let me find a place for Amira." His response came sharp and brutal, "You should have thought of that before becoming a liability." Evelyn arrived just as Philip ordered the housekeeper to unlock the front gate and toss their bags out. The rain had barely let up when Diana and Amira were wheeled and walked into the unforgiving outdoors. Evelyn rushed to grab as many of Diana's things as she could, clothes, medicine, Amira's school bag, but most of what they owned was left behind in closets they were no longer allowed to open. Diana sat motionless in her wheelchair, soaked, her hands gripping her daughter who was sobbing uncontrollably. They stood on the sidewalk like strangers to their own life. Sabrina peeked from the upstairs window, phone in hand, no doubt ready to post a filtered selfie with some vague, triumphant caption. Evelyn didn't say a word to Philip as she helped Diana into her old sedan and placed Amira in the back seat. The ride to the women's shelter downtown was quiet except for the occasional sob from Amira and the sound of Evelyn's hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Diana said nothing, just watched the city blur past through teary eyes. Every building, every passing car felt like a world too fast for her shattered soul. Evelyn finally whispered, "You'll rise again, Dee. You will. I swear it." Diana nodded once, though her heart didn't yet believe it. The shelter was cold and overfilled, but it was a roof, and it was safe. Evelyn had called in favors with the pastor's wife and a social worker friend who agreed to fast-track their intake. Diana was given a tiny corner in a shared room, partitioned by thin curtains and furnished with a single cot and a worn armchair. Her wheelchair barely fit. Amira curled up beside her, hugging her mother's waist like a lifeline. That night, as Diana stared at the flickering ceiling light, she realized she had lost everything: status, marriage, comfort, even dignity. But in that moment of rock bottom, something flickered inside her. Not anger. Not revenge. But resolve. She had no choice but to survive, for Amira, and for the pieces of herself that hadn't yet been broken. The next morning, she signed up for community-based therapy, food stamps, and even asked the shelter's staff for any job openings that allowed her to work with her hands. That was when the janitor, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret, said, "You know, we're looking for a part-time cleaner at the church up the hill. It's not much, but—" Diana smiled weakly. "I'll take it." She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was crawling toward a new beginning, one painful inch at a time. Her therapy began in a modest clinic sponsored by the shelter's social program. It was there she met Elena, a stern but kind physiotherapist who had once recovered from a spinal injury herself. Elena didn't sugarcoat anything. "You might not walk perfectly again," she told Diana on their first day. "But if you're ready to work, really work, we'll see what's possible." And so began the grueling process: exercises that made her scream, stretches that brought tears to her eyes, moments when Diana wanted to give up entirely. But then she would remember Amira's sleepy "I love you, Mommy," or the way Evelyn whispered scripture into her spirit after particularly hard days, and she would press on. 4 months, progress came in inches. Then, one rainy afternoon, Diana stood. Just for a moment. Just on one leg. But it was enough to make Elena cry and Amira scream with joy. From that day forward, Diana's faith became muscle, and her courage became motion. She started practicing with crutches, then without. And every painful step was a victory march for a woman the world had left for dead. 6 months after being discarded, Diana walked, unaided, into Evelyn's kitchen. Evelyn dropped the bowl of dough she was mixing and screamed. "You're standing." Diana nodded, tears brimming. "I'm walking," she whispered. That night, they baked together like old times, the scent of cinnamon and fried plantains filling the air like incense. Diana's next decision shocked everyone. She resigned from her cleaning job at the church and applied for a taxi training course offered through a women's reintegration nonprofit. "I want to be mobile," she explained. "I want to be the driver of my life again." She passed the course with flying colors and received her cab driver's permit within a few weeks. The nonprofit even helped her acquire a second-hand taxi van modified for mobility ease. Amira painted a tiny pink flower on the dashboard as a good luck charm. Now each morning, Diana woke up, dressed herself, kissed her daughter's forehead, and stepped into a world that had once rejected her, with strength, purpose, and unshakable grace. The crippled woman everyone pitied was gone. In her place stood someone unstoppable, someone the future would soon recognize. The days that followed were long, quiet, and soaked in humility. Diana began working as a cleaner at the local church up the hill, a building that once echoed her worship songs now echoed her mop strokes. She cleaned pews where she once stood leading choirs, scrubbed toilets where she once prepared sermon notes, and emptied trash from the same classrooms where she had taught Sunday school. But there was no bitterness in her spirit, only surrender. Every swipe of her rag was a prayer, every sweep of the broom a declaration, "I'm still here." The church elders, though surprised to see her working there, never judged. In fact, some offered quiet words of encouragement, and one elderly deacon named Brother Malcolm began leaving envelopes with small bills tucked beneath the pulpit just for her. Evelyn remained her rock, helping with Amira's school pickups and accompanying Diana to physical therapy appointments when her schedule allowed. But Diana didn't want pity. She refused it. What she craved was dignity, earned, not handed. She would reclaim her life, not by demanding justice from Philip or crying out for sympathy, but by building something beautiful from the rubble. While Diana was quietly rebuilding her life from scraps, across town, Philip's once glorious career was beginning to unravel thread by thread. On the surface, everything still looked polished. He still wore the same designer suits, drove the same leased car, and hosted lavish wine tastings in the hotel's executive lounge. But beneath the illusion was chaos. Sabrina, who had initially charmed the board members with her charisma and daring promotional stunts, had become a liability. She convinced Philip to approve extravagant events that went beyond the hotel's budget, private celebrity parties, exclusive champagne brunches, and influencer retreats with little to no returns. What started as a series of minor overages snowballed into untraceable expenses, blurred invoices, and outright fund misappropriations. Philip, too entangled in the thrill of success and too blinded by Sabrina's seductive grip, ignored the red flags. He was frequently absent from management meetings, rarely followed proper accounting procedures, and dismissed staff concerns with smug arrogance. What he failed to see was that the board of directors had begun to take notice. Their patience was running out, and fast. The final straw came on a Friday night when a high-profile event Sabrina organized spiraled into disaster. A luxury brand launch party hosted at the rooftop bar turned into a scandalous tabloid nightmare. Uninvited influencers showed up, there were allegations of illegal substances, and one intoxicated guest had to be carried out by paramedics. Hotel guests complained endlessly. Videos surfaced online, with Philip seen dancing shirtless in the background, drink in hand, while Sabrina kissed another man by the pool. The hotel's reputation took an immediate hit. Bookings dropped. Long-standing corporate clients pulled out. And within a week, the hotel owner, Mr. Carl Whitmore, a stern and detail-obsessed businessman, flew in from Manhattan. He demanded a forensic audit of the hotel's finances. What they found was damning: embezzled funds, forged approvals, missing receipts, and unauthorized wire transfers. The accounting department threw Philip under the bus, claiming he had approved nearly all expenses verbally. Sabrina, predictably, disappeared that weekend, her office desk empty and her phone permanently off. When Carl summoned Philip for a meeting on Monday morning, he didn't mince words. "You're done here. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Philip's fall from grace was swift and humiliating. As he packed his things, his overpriced cologne, designer pens, and scattered keepsakes from a life of showmanship, he realized there was no one to defend him. Not one staff member spoke up. Not even the receptionist he used to flirt with looked him in the eye. Outside the hotel, the paparazzi who once courted him now captured his walk of shame. He tried calling Sabrina, but her number was no longer in service. His bank account, once padded with performance bonuses, was frozen pending investigation. His lease agreements were voided due to reputational damage, and within days, he found himself evicted from the very luxury apartment he had moved into after throwing Diana out. With nowhere else to go and pride too bruised to contact his estranged sister Marissa, Philip slept in his car for a week, surviving off vending machine snacks and leftover hotel mini bottles of gin. And for the first time in years, he thought of Diana, not as the burden he believed her to be, but as the only person who had ever prayed for him when no one else did. But by then, the damage he caused was too great, and the road back to her was one paved with thorns, regret, and consequences he could no longer outrun. Diana had settled into her new rhythm, an odd but empowering one. Driving a taxi wasn't glamorous, but it gave her freedom. It was the first job in years where she didn't have to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. Every morning before the city stirred, she would wake Amira, braid her hair, pack her lunch, and drop her off at school before heading to her taxi shift. She learned the city in new ways, its shortcuts, its hidden alleys, the rhythm of early morning commuters and night shift workers. Her cab became more than a car. It was a sanctuary. She kept it neat, added a small cross hanging on the rearview mirror, and always kept a bottle of water and candy for passengers. She rarely made conversation unless someone initiated it, but when they did, they often left her cab with more than just a ride. They left with a story, a prayer, or a word of encouragement they hadn't expected. Diana, unknowingly, was ministering from behind a steering wheel. And while the world remained unaware, God was orchestrating a new chapter that would change her life once more. It was an unusually hot Tuesday when she was dispatched to the international arrivals terminal at Monroe Airport. Her back ached slightly from the long shift, but she smiled through it. She always did. The passenger she was to pick up had requested an executive-class ride, but due to a system glitch, her cab was assigned instead. As she waited at the curb holding a printed placard with the name Morgan Sinclair, she wasn't expecting much. Then he appeared. Tall, sharply dressed, with an air of confidence that didn't scream but whispered wealth. Morgan Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Holdings, a name Diana vaguely recognized from news features and finance shows Evelyn sometimes watched. He paused when he saw the cab, an eyebrow arched in confusion. But when he met Diana's eyes, something shifted. "I requested an executive car," he said lightly, though not rudely. Diana, ever composed, smiled and replied, "I'm not a limo, sir, but I'll get you there safe, and I have mints." It was unexpected. Morgan laughed, genuinely, and opened the door. "Mints are underrated," he said, and got in. The ride to his destination, an upscale hotel on the edge of downtown, was laced with unexpected conversation. At first, it was the usual, weather, traffic, business travel woes. But something about Diana's calm presence, her thoughtful responses, and her subtle humor intrigued Morgan. She wasn't trying to impress him, and that was refreshing. As they drove through the city, he asked how long she had been a cab driver. Diana hesitated, then replied, "Not long. Life had to break me a little before I found the strength to start over." The honesty in her voice caught Morgan off guard. He asked no further questions, only nodded slowly, absorbing more than her words. When they arrived, he handed her a crisp bill, far more than the fare, but Diana shook her head. "I'm not taking more than it's worth," she said. Morgan smiled. "Then I'll take your number. In case I ever need a ride worth more than money." For a moment, Diana was speechless. She handed him her contact, and as he walked into the hotel, something in her heart stirred. She didn't know it yet, but a new door had opened, a divine collision masked as coincidence, a miracle rolling quietly into motion from the back seat of a humble taxi. Morgan Sinclair kept his word. Less than a week after the cab ride, Diana received a call from an unfamiliar number. His voice was warm and clear, with that unmistakable undertone of curiosity. "I'm in town again," he said. "And I'd like you to drive me, if you're available." Though surprised, Diana accepted. She picked him up the next morning, and unlike last time, he sat in the front seat. Their conversations deepened. He asked about her favorite part of driving, and she spoke not of roads, but of people. "Everyone's going somewhere," she said. "I'm just honored to be a small part of their journey." Morgan listened, really listened, like few men ever had. Over the following weeks, he continued to request her rides personally, business meetings, charity galas, even casual drives through the city when he had downtime. But it wasn't just about transportation anymore. He had started observing her, the quiet resilience in her voice, the way she lit up when she spoke about Amira, the strength she didn't know she radiated. One afternoon, after an event with his foundation board, he asked, "Diana, have you ever considered working outside of driving?" She glanced at him cautiously. "Why?" His reply, "Because I think the world needs more women like you leading from the front, not just behind the wheel." A week later, Morgan formally offered her a position at the Sinclair Foundation, a nonprofit wing of his corporation that provided educational scholarships, rehabilitation programs, and women's reintegration support. The role was in logistics, organizing community outreach, managing event schedules, coordinating transport and communication between beneficiaries and volunteers. It was everything Diana loved: structure, service, and people. But she hesitated. She didn't feel qualified. She didn't have a college degree. "I'm just a cab driver," she told Morgan during one of their drives. He looked at her, brow furrowed. "Diana, you're the most qualified person I've met for this job. You've lived what our beneficiaries are surviving. That's not a weakness. That's your edge." After a night of prayer, tears, and long conversation with Evelyn, Diana said yes. On her first day at the foundation, dressed in a donated blazer, she stood outside the building and whispered, "God, walk in before me." That step forward felt like crossing an invisible bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. And just like that, Diana was no longer surviving, she was ascending. Her presence at the foundation became a quiet force of change. Within a month, she organized a rehabilitation seminar for young mothers who had escaped domestic abuse. She personally visited shelters to recruit women too broken to dream again, and when they saw her, elegant, kind, and walking on her own 2 feet, they believed healing was possible. She spoke little about her past, but when she did, it carried weight. The staff admired her, clients respected her, and even the coldest board members started noticing how things ran smoother under her touch. Amira, too, was blossoming. With better financial support, Diana enrolled her in a small performing arts academy where her talent in ballet shone. Evelyn, watching it all unfold, often marveled, "You're not just rebuilding your life, Dee. You're building an empire of healing." Meanwhile, Morgan, though still professional, grew more visibly moved by her presence. He started staying after meetings, seeking her input, asking about Amira, and finding excuses to linger just a few moments longer. Diana noticed, but said nothing. Her heart was still guarded, but hope had begun to tiptoe into the room. She was no longer the woman who begged to stay. She was the woman they now invited in, applauded, and needed. And for the first time in a very long time, Diana Matthews looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw a woman rising, not because she had escaped the fire, but because she had learned how to walk through it with grace. The spiral of Philip Johnson's life was no longer gradual, it was a freefall. After his abrupt firing, news spread quickly in industry circles. His name, once synonymous with innovative hotel management, now triggered whispers of mismanagement, arrogance, and scandal. The videos from the rooftop disaster were still floating on the internet, staining his reputation further. Philip tried to apply for several hotel jobs, some local, some out of state, but was met with closed doors and cold replies. No one wanted to take a chance on a man whose last project ended in theft allegations and online shame. He called Sabrina, no answer. He visited her old apartment, vacant. She had drained the last of their shared account before vanishing, leaving him with nothing but a few suits, maxed-out credit cards, and a hollow ache of betrayal. He blamed her, at first. Then the hotel. Then Diana. But slowly, the rage gave way to something more corrosive, self-loathing. It crept in during sleepless nights in cheap motel rooms, aided him during long walks with no destination, and whispered cruel truths into his ear as he stared at ceilings stained with mildew. Without steady income, Philip's lifestyle deteriorated rapidly. He sold off his designer watches, then his car, and finally the few electronics he had left. The once pristine man who mocked Diana's simplicity was now unshaven, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. One evening, as he wandered through a bus station, hoping for shelter from the biting cold, he passed a television playing inside a small electronics store. On it was a local news feature highlighting the Sinclair Foundation's new women's reintegration program, led by none other than Diana Matthews. She was glowing, composed, and strong, walking beside a group of women with clipboards in her hands and a mirror by her side. Philip froze. It was the first time he had seen her since the day he'd tossed her into the rain like yesterday's mistake. He stared in disbelief, mouth ajar, as the reporter introduced her as a pillar of hope and redemption. And just like that, the weight of everything he'd lost hit him like a freight train, not the job, not the money, but the woman who had once prayed over his dreams, the daughter who once called him her hero, and the family he'd traded for illusions. Driven by desperation, Philip began showing up at places he hoped Diana might be. Once, he waited outside the community center where Amira took ballet classes, hiding behind a parked van just to catch a glimpse of her. She had grown, taller, more graceful. He wept silently, realizing how much of her life he had missed. Another time, he wandered near the Sinclair Foundation building, watching from across the street as Diana stepped into a car with a man he didn't recognize, Morgan. The man held the door for her, then gently placed a hand on her back. It wasn't intimate, but it was respectful. And that stung more than anything. Philip, now living in a shelter near the train station, scribbled letters he never sent. Letters filled with regret, apologies, confessions. But he never found the courage to hand them over. He wanted to fix everything, to crawl back into the life he destroyed. But deep down, he knew, some things can't be repaired with words. Some betrayals echo longer than forgiveness. And Diana, whether he liked it or not, had already begun a new chapter, one that didn't include his name. The day Philip finally approached Diana wasn't planned. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days and had slept beneath a collapsed bus stop bench, using his coat as a blanket. His pride, once thicker than armor, had eroded to dust. He waited until the end of the workday and positioned himself across from the Sinclair Foundation's headquarters, watching staff members exit one after the other. When he saw her, Diana, in a pale blue blouse and gray skirt, holding a folder and laughing gently with a security guard, something shattered inside him. She looked different. Not just healthier, but free. The chains he once wrapped around her had long since rusted away. He crossed the street slowly, heart pounding, mouth dry. "Diana," he called, voice hoarse. She turned, brows furrowed, the color draining slightly from her face. For a long second, they stood in silence. The man who'd once sworn to protect her now stood before her like a ghost, thin, unkempt, and trembling. "Please," he said, "just a minute." Diana glanced at the guard, who instinctively stepped closer, but she raised a hand. "It's all right." Philip stumbled through apologies, rambling about mistakes, about how everything fell apart after she left. He spoke of Sabrina's betrayal, of losing the hotel, of watching Amira dance from a distance and realizing the gravity of what he'd lost. "I messed up, Diana. God knows, I did. I don't expect anything. I want you to know I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I see you now, the woman you've become, and I can't even recognize myself anymore." Diana listened, her face unreadable. But beneath her calm exterior, 1,000 emotions surged: heartbreak, disbelief, a flicker of pain, and then, peace. When he finally fell silent, she stepped forward, not with anger, not with pity, but with dignity. "Philip," she said softly, "I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake, but for mine." He blinked, confused. Then, "Does that mean," she shook her head slowly. "No. Forgiveness is not a free pass. It's a door I closed so I could heal. But I won't open it again. You were a chapter, not the whole story." Her words didn't carry venom, but they carved into his soul like truth only pain could write. As Diana turned to leave, Morgan stepped out of the building and instinctively walked to her side, noticing Philip. He placed a gentle hand on Diana's shoulder, silently asking if she was all right. She nodded. Morgan's presence wasn't possessive, but protective, a silent wall of strength. Philip stepped back, as if punched. He finally understood, Diana wasn't alone anymore, and she certainly wasn't broken. He watched as the two walked toward the parking lot, Amira racing ahead to meet them, backpack bouncing. She hugged Diana first, then waved shyly at Morgan before skipping toward the car. Philip stood in the same spot, his breath stolen. The very family he discarded was flourishing without him. That night, back at the shelter, he opened the envelope containing one of his many unsent letters. He read it aloud to no one, then burned it in a rusted trash barrel outside. Some men are only given one miracle, and he had squandered his. Diana, meanwhile, returned home lighter, not because she'd erased the past, but because she'd survived it. And that survival had turned into something holy, untouchable, and gloriously out of reach for the man who once believed she'd never rise again. Amira's ballet performance was scheduled for a quiet Saturday afternoon at the city's modest but charming cultural arts center. For weeks, Diana had watched her daughter train with unwavering focus, rising early, practicing pirouettes in their tiny apartment hallway, and humming melodies under her breath. It wasn't just dancing for Amira, it was healing. It was her way of finding joy again after months of upheaval, instability, and emotional bruises she was too young to name. Diana noticed the spark returning to her daughter's eyes, the same spark that had vanished during the chaos with Philip. Morgan, who had become more present in both their lives, had surprised Amira with a new pair of ballet shoes a week before the event. "Every dancer needs the right shoes," he'd said with a warm smile. Amira beamed, hugged him without hesitation, and twirled 3 times in the middle of the living room. For Diana, watching them together was equal parts comforting and terrifying. Her daughter was growing attached to a man who might one day disappear. But deep inside, a soft voice reminded her, Morgan was nothing like Philip. The day of the recital arrived with golden sunlight spilling across the pavement as Diana and Evelyn helped Amira into her pastel pink tutu. Her hair was pulled neatly into a bun, and she wore a tiny gold necklace Diana had bought from a thrift store, a symbol of pride and resilience. The performance hall filled gradually with parents, relatives, and teachers. Morgan arrived just before the curtains rose, dressed in a navy blazer, holding a small bouquet of lilies for Amira. Diana's heart thudded when he sat beside her and whispered, "I wouldn't miss this for the world." As the lights dimmed and the stage lit up, Diana held her breath. Amira's group was the last to perform. When her name was announced, the little girl stepped onto the stage with a confidence that brought tears to Diana's eyes. She danced with grace, poise, and emotion far beyond her years. And in the final seconds of the routine, she looked out into the audience and smiled directly at Diana. It was a silent declaration, "Look, Mommy. I made it too." When the show ended and the children filed off stage, Amira ran into Diana's arms, squealing, "Did you see me? Did I do okay?" Diana laughed through tears, squeezing her tightly. "You were perfect." Evelyn handed over tissues, sniffling beside her. Morgan presented the flowers with a bow, and Amira giggled before hugging him too. A photographer approached, asking if they wanted a family picture. Diana hesitated, then nodded. The 3 of them, Diana, Amira, and Morgan, stood together under the warm light, the camera flashing to freeze a moment none of them would ever forget. Meanwhile, across town in a noisy shelter filled with coughing and worn-out bodies, Philip stared blankly at a tattered screen on the common room TV. A local channel was airing snippets of the ballet recital. When the camera panned to the audience and paused briefly on Diana and Morgan clapping proudly, Philip leaned forward. The image lingered just long enough for him to register what he had truly lost, not just a wife, but a legacy, a daughter's trust, and a place he could never reclaim. For Diana, however, that moment marked something else, a turning point. Not of closure, but of opening. A door not into the past, but into a possible future, one where joy no longer felt borrowed, and love wasn't a lesson in survival. The invitation came a week later, an elegantly embossed envelope slid across Diana's desk at the Sinclair Foundation by Morgan himself. It was for the Sinclair Global Annual Charity Gala, a prestigious black-tie event attended by philanthropists, tech leaders, and business elites from across the state. Diana blinked at it, stunned. "I'm not. Morgan, I don't belong in that room," she said, her voice low. He leaned on the edge of her desk, his gaze steady. "You do. You're the reason half of this year's initiatives worked. You're the heartbeat of this foundation." He smiled, the warmth in his eyes quiet but undeniable. "Plus, Amira's already excited about dressing up. Evelyn's been texting me pictures of her dress options." Diana raised a brow. "You've been texting Evelyn?" Morgan chuckled. She made it impossible not to. It was the first time in a long while Diana laughed without restraint. That evening, as she zipped Amira into her little purple gown and stared at herself in the mirror wearing a donated gold dress from a boutique Morgan partnered with, she no longer saw a survivor or a victim. She saw a woman stepping into the next chapter with her head high. The gala was held in a stunning glass ballroom overlooking the city skyline, its floors lined with soft white lighting and crystal chandeliers that danced with every turn of the room. Diana entered with Amira on one side and Evelyn on the other, their trio drawing stares, not of judgment, but admiration. She saw familiar faces, colleagues, donors, even volunteers from her early days. But what shocked her most were the faces of old acquaintances from Philip's world. Former hotel staff, industry partners, even board members who once dined with Philip and looked down on her simplicity, now greeted her with awe. One executive leaned in and whispered, "You're the one they wrote about. The woman who turned her life into a movement." Diana smiled gracefully, nodding, though the words left a lump in her throat. She never intended to become a symbol, but perhaps brokenness, when mended by grace, becomes the loudest sermon. As the speeches rolled in and awards were presented, Morgan took the stage and publicly thanked Diana by name. "There are leaders who rise because of power," he said, looking directly at her. "And there are those who rise because of purpose. Diana Matthews is the latter." The room erupted in applause. Evelyn wept quietly. Amira stood on her tiptoes to clap harder. Philip saw it all from a public library computer. He had typed Diana's name into the search bar out of habit and found a live stream link to the gala. When Morgan spoke her name, when the crowd clapped and the camera panned to her standing in that golden dress, radiant and calm, Philip stared at the screen as if it had turned into a mirror of his regrets. His hand trembled. The comments section exploded with praise. "She's amazing. What a story. Diana Matthews deserves the world." Philip's chest ached with something he couldn't quite name, beyond regret, beyond shame. It was the soul-deep agony of a man who had burned his bridge and then realized it had led to paradise. Back at the gala, Morgan returned to Diana's side and whispered, "Thank you for saying yes to tonight. And thank you for saying yes to yourself." Diana turned to him, heart-pounding, her reply quiet but firm. "I'm still learning how." Morgan nodded. "Good. Because I'm still learning how to stand beside someone like you." The words settled gently between them, not as a promise, but as an invitation. And for the first time in years, Diana allowed herself to imagine the possibility of love that didn't come with conditions. Only respect, restoration, and something golden waiting just beyond the pain. The days after the gala felt like living in a dream, one not built from fantasy, but from faith that had been tested, tempered, and transformed. Requests began pouring in from women's groups, churches, nonprofits, and even local colleges for Diana to speak about her journey. At first, she declined them all. The thought of standing on a stage and revealing the scars of her past was terrifying. But Morgan gently nudged her. "Sometimes healing someone else is how we finish healing ourselves." It was Evelyn who finally convinced her. "Your story's no longer just yours, Dee. It's a lifeline for someone still drowning." Diana eventually agreed to one event, a women's conference hosted by a faith-based organization in the city. The theme was Rebuild, Beauty from Ashes. That single word, rebuild, echoed in her spirit for days. The night before the conference, she fasted, prayed, and wept alone on her knees, asking God to speak through her, not for applause or pity, but purpose. When the morning came, she stood behind the podium with trembling hands but unwavering conviction. Her story poured out like oil, slow, thick with emotion, and shining with truth. She spoke about the accident, the betrayal, the tears that soaked her pillow in the shelter, the days she couldn't feel her legs, the heartbreak of signing divorce papers in a wheelchair. She talked about the loneliness, the judgment, the nights she wanted to quit but kept going because Amira needed a mother who didn't break. And then she spoke of grace. How faith met her in broken places. How love, real love, doesn't bruise or belittle, but builds. How forgiveness doesn't mean returning to pain, but releasing it so it doesn't poison the future. The auditorium was silent except for sniffles and gasps. When she finished, the entire room stood and clapped, not out of politeness, but reverence. Dozens of women rushed forward in tears, hugging her, thanking her for saying what they had never been able to say themselves. Someone filmed the speech. It went viral within days. Suddenly, Diana Matthews was no longer just a cab driver or a foundation assistant, she was a voice. A vessel. A lighthouse for the shipwrecked. The newfound spotlight didn't change Diana, but it did open doors she had never imagined. Book publishers reached out. Influential pastors sent invitations. But she remained grounded, anchored by the same scriptures that had carried her through her darkest hours. Her focus remained on Amira, on the women she now mentored weekly at the shelter, and on the foundation work she still loved. Morgan, too, had changed subtly. He grew quieter around her, not distant, but more reverent, as though realizing the weight of the woman standing beside him. He no longer tried to impress her or lead her, he simply stood with her. And that, more than any confession of affection, spoke volumes. One evening, after watching Amira practice ballet in the living room, Diana sat beside Morgan and whispered, "I don't know what tomorrow looks like." He turned to her, eyes soft. "That's okay. I'm not here to predict your future. I'm just here to be present in it." It wasn't a love declaration. It was something better. It was faith, reborn not just in God, but in humanity. In goodness. In second chances. And for the first time since her marriage had shattered, Diana allowed herself to rest in that truth, fully and freely. The knock on the door came on a rainy evening just after Amira had fallen asleep and Diana was folding freshly laundered clothes in silence. The soft rhythm of the rain against the windows matched the heaviness that suddenly crept into the room as she approached the door. Evelyn had left an hour ago, and Morgan was out of town for a board retreat. Diana wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she froze. Standing under the flickering hallway light was a frail, unshaven Philip. His once pristine appearance had long given way to rags and hollow eyes. He held no umbrella, just a soggy plastic bag clutched against his chest. "I didn't know where else to go," he croaked. His voice was a ghost of itself. For a brief second, Diana considered closing the door. But something in her, maybe compassion, maybe closure, made her step aside. "One night. That's all I can offer," she said softly, not with love or pity, but with a heart that had long made peace with the past. She made him tea. Not because he asked, but because kindness remained in her DNA. Philip sipped it silently, trembling. He sat on the edge of the couch like he didn't belong, and Diana sat opposite him, folding the last of Amira's dresses. "You look different," he said, eyes scanning her like he couldn't believe she was real. "Stronger. Happier." Diana met his gaze and nodded. "I am." The silence between them was heavy with memories, wedding vows, shattered trust, wheelchair tears, eviction, and survival. Then Philip broke. He leaned forward, his hands covering his face, and sobbed. Not the quiet kind, but the deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a man who had finally seen the mountain of destruction he'd caused. "I was a fool, Diana. I lost everything. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it out loud. I'm sorry." Diana inhaled, her hand stilling on the laundry. She let his apology sit in the room. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase what had been done. But it acknowledged the wounds. She stood, walked to him, and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "I forgave you long ago," she said. "But forgiveness isn't a doorway back. It's a road forward without resentment." The next morning, Diana prepared him breakfast and gave him a clean shirt from a donation bag she kept for the Foundation's outreach program. He ate quietly, thanked her, and stood at the door with hesitation. "Can I see Amira?" he asked, voice cracking. Diana shook her head gently. "She's sleeping. And she's healing. Let's not confuse that." Philip nodded slowly, tears welling again, then stepped out into the morning mist. She didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. That chapter was closed, not with anger, but with acceptance. Later that day, as she walked into her office at the Foundation, Morgan was already there, returned earlier than expected. He looked at her with concern, reading something behind her eyes. "You okay?" he asked. Diana smiled faintly. "I said goodbye to a ghost last night." Morgan didn't press. He simply walked over, pulled out her chair, and let her sit. In the quietness of the office, with the scent of fresh paper and brewed coffee filling the air, Diana felt lighter than she had in years. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had finally released. The final goodbye wasn't just to Philip, it was to the pain, the shame, the part of her that once thought she wasn't enough. That woman no longer existed. And in her place stood someone whole. The morning after Philip's final visit felt strangely calm. There was no emotional hangover, no inner conflict, just a profound sense of quiet resolve. Diana went about her routine, preparing Amira's breakfast, tying her hair into a neat ponytail, and packing her school bag, but even Amira noticed something different. "Mommy, you're smiling with your eyes today," she said with the innocent wisdom only children possess. Diana paused and kissed her forehead. "Maybe it's because something heavy left our hearts." Evelyn, who came by to pick up a few supplies for a church event, grinned knowingly when Diana told her about Philip's visit. "It took strength to open that door," Evelyn said. "But it took even more to close it the right way." Diana nodded. The real surprise came that evening. Morgan invited Diana and Amira to a private dinner, not a gala, not a board event, just a peaceful meal on the rooftop terrace of the Sinclair Foundation, now decorated with soft fairy lights and a gentle breeze that rustled the linen tablecloths. "Just us," he said. And it was perfect. They didn't talk about work or charity. They talked about childhood memories, silly dreams, and their favorite books. Amira giggled nonstop between bites of her favorite pasta as Morgan made funny faces and told corny riddles. But beneath the laughter and shared stories was an undercurrent, something tender and cautious, a quiet bridge forming between two hearts long scarred by the past. After Amira fell asleep on a couch nearby wrapped in Diana's scarf, Morgan leaned forward. "I didn't plan this," he began, voice low. "I didn't expect to fall for someone who had already lived 1,000 lives in one. But I have. Diana. I love the way you've rebuilt yourself. I love how you treat everyone with dignity, how you lead without shouting, how you listen like it's an art." Diana's breath caught in her throat. For years, she had feared those words, feared they'd come from the wrong mouth, feared she'd trust again and fall back into pain. But Morgan was different. His love didn't beg or demand. It offered. She didn't respond with a dramatic declaration. She simply reached across the table, placed her hand over his, and whispered, "Let's walk slowly." "But yes. I'm ready." The following weekend, Evelyn organized a small gathering at a quiet vineyard she had once catered for, saying it was just a thank-you picnic for Diana's team. But everyone knew better. It was the first time Diana's co-workers, Amira's teachers, and Morgan's family mingled together. Amira danced barefoot in the grass, her laughter echoing across the fields. Morgan stayed close to Diana's side, never overbearing, just present. At one point, as the golden hour light painted the world in hues of amber, he pulled her aside beneath a pergola laced with vines. He held out a small velvet box, not flashy, not extravagant, just simple and meaningful. Inside was a delicate ring adorned with a sapphire stone. "This isn't a proposal," he said. "Not yet. This is a promise. That I'll walk beside you, not ahead, not behind, but with you, every step." Diana's eyes welled with tears, not from the gesture, but from the healing it represented. She slid the ring onto her finger and whispered, "Then let's keep walking." And in that quiet vineyard, surrounded by laughter, flowers, and a daughter whose joy was blooming, Diana didn't feel rescued. She felt chosen, not for what she had endured, but for who she had become. And that made all the difference. The launch day of Diana's new Christian Wellness and Rehabilitation Center arrived with the same quiet grace that had followed her journey from the very beginning. The building, nestled in a serene part of the city surrounded by flowering jacaranda trees and open sky, was a symbol of everything she had fought through. The plaque above the entrance read, "The Haven of Grace, where broken wings learn to fly again." Inside were counseling rooms filled with light, prayer spaces decorated with scripture verses, and therapy lounges tailored for survivors of trauma, women who, like Diana once did, needed a space to rebuild from the ashes. What had started as a whisper in her heart had become a refuge for many. The opening ceremony was intentionally intimate. Evelyn, standing tall in a navy blue suit, gave the welcoming speech. Morgan, hand in hand with Diana, offered a quiet prayer. Amira stood proudly at the front in a sunflower yellow dress, holding scissors too big for her little hands, ready to help cut the ribbon. When the moment came, Diana stepped forward, tears already spilling. "To every woman who has been told she is too broken to be whole again, this place is for you." The crowd erupted in applause as the ribbon fell. Cameras flashed, and the press captured every moment, but Diana's mind wasn't on the attention. Her thoughts were with the women who would soon walk through those doors, the single mothers, the abuse survivors, the former addicts, the displaced, and the grieving. She remembered the shelter where she once shared a cot with Amira, the church floors she scrubbed, the nights she fell asleep in a wheelchair whispering prayers through clenched teeth. All of that pain had not been wasted. It had become purpose. Inside the center, a mural painted across the entrance wall showed a woman kneeling in the rain, reaching toward the sky as golden light poured over her, a visual homage to her most broken yet most transformative season. As guests toured the facility, some wept openly. A group of women who had once lived with Diana in the shelter hugged her tightly. "You showed us that it's possible," one whispered. "You made us believe again." Diana hugged them back, her smile laced with tears. "No," she said. "God made me believe again. I just followed his light." Far away, in a crumbling community shelter, Philip sat huddled beside a broken heater, flipping through a worn magazine someone had left behind. His eyes fell upon a page showing the grand opening of the Haven of Grace. The headline read, "From Tragedy to Triumph, Diana Matthews Opens Center for Women in Need." A photo captured her mid-laughter, hand clasped with Morgan, a mirror standing between them like a radiant bridge. Philip stared at it for a long time, a bitter smile curling his lips. There were no more letters to write, no more apologies to give. He had made his choices. All he could do now was bear witness to the life that had blossomed without him. Meanwhile, back at the center, as the event wound down, Diana stepped outside, barefoot in the grass. Morgan joined her, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked. Diana looked up at the sky, no longer searching for answers, just soaking in the peace that finally resided in her soul. "I'm whole," she replied. "And that's better than happiness." And with the sun setting over her new beginning, Diana Matthews finally exhaled the past and embraced the future, bold, free, and beautifully redeemed. The end.